Hi, good afternoon. So I'm sure all of you are familiar with the concept of AI code assistance, right? And this whole concept of vibe coding. And if you're not using it, you probably wonder, um, you know, what are the details about it? Is it really something that you can rely on, and can you really build enterprise quality solutions with those tools, right? So with today's presentation, we're gonna take a spin at that, and we're gonna get deep into the process of vibe coding and how we can leverage some of these AI tools uh, for the development process, for the development lifecycle process. And that's the key here. That it is not those tools are not here to kind of build everything for you, but instead be able to help you build solutions, enterprise solutions. So let's see how do we go about to do that. So welcome. My name is Oscar. I'm really glad to have you here. My background is enterprise solutions architect. I build AI, web-based, and cloud-native solutions. I'm also the author of Data Engineering Process Fundamentals. Please take a look at that. You can just scan that QR code, and that takes you to a hub where I have links on for GitHub repos and my contact information. All right. So, okay, at a very high level, just to talk about a snapshot of today's topic, we want to actually talk about what is chaos versus the concept of AI storming, right? And what do we mean by that? So with this whole process of AI, right, and vibe coding, which is one of those hot buzzwords now being thrown out there, there is this notion, right, that you can actually, as a developer, you can just go ahead and sit in front of one of those code assistance AI tools and be able to just whip out a solution. I'm sure you often heard this comment from someone that says, "Hey, it took me 3 hours to build a whole website," or whatever, right? Whatever they needed to do. And they don't give you enough context on what that means, right? It only shows maybe that something is running on a web browser and it looks great. But for enterprise quality, we need to understand what's behind it. How does it really work? Is it really maintained? What is the security like, and so on, right? So those concerns, enterprise level concerns, are really important. And how do we follow this process and use those tools to set up and be able to build something that has governance, security, and is really following your development the standards and guidelines, right? So let's compare this, right? When you hear this, oh, it took me 30 minutes to build something, or 2 hours to build something. In reality, this is what we call chaos, right? So it is effective. It is effective for what you want to do. If it is just a one-off, but it's really not, maybe the product is really not there 100%. But let's talk about the process. The process is really, you use one of those tools. You probably use Copilot, Microsoft Copilot, um, or any other AI assistant tool, and you start going, hey, I want to build an app, and I want to build a React application that can show product information, and that I can do the following things, right? And the AI will pick up on what you're saying, and the way you're saying it, right? You write in your prompts. I should be clear about that. You're passing your prompts, you're typing it, and the AI, based on what it knows, because it has trained on so much code, it's gonna go out there, right, and find, do I have in memory? Do I recall having React applications? Did I learn about this? Did I learn about building forms and doing this? And he knows, it's very good at knowing that information. And it will just, based on what he knows, he'll build something. However, if we start comparing that information with, um, how do I, you know, how does it follow my coding standards, right? How does it is actually using our design patterns and our requirements and so on? Once you start cross-checking with that information, then you see that there's probably a gap on that. Excuse me. So how do we address that, right? How do we deal with that, and how do we actually leverage those tools, and those concepts to be able to build something that is very high quality, right? So the short answer for that is that the same principles apply, and the same principles of software development, of discovery, requirement gatherings, and specifications are applicable with these concepts. So in the traditional process, we always work as a team, and we understand the problem statement of what we're trying to achieve. So we start doing some discovery, right? So the discovery process is really where you start doing brainstorming, right, about what you're trying to build. What are you trying to answer, to solve, and what is the ultimately the product or the solution that you're putting together, because this works not just for products but for data engineering solutions and so on, right? So you start working with the team, and you have product owners and things like that, and you start building what we call specifications, right? You draft the discovery documentation, the requirements, you start writing the documentation. So the output of that process, just like we have always done, is to write those specifications. So now once we have those specifications, this is actually what we can use for the concept of a specification-driven design. For specification-driven design now, basically what that means is that you can feed that information into your AI, and the AI can follow some of those guidelines, right? So governance, requirements, security requirements, and so on. And as much as you document that, then you keep that AI um, um, within your guardrails, right? Within the limits and the domain knowledge that you provide. So it will follow and execute what you're telling it with the specs, based on the specs. And this is an agile, interactive process, right? And what I mean by that is really not that you write the spec and you're done, and AI builds something, and it builds the deployments and so on, and the cloud resources. It's not like that. It's really usually, as we do normally in any traditional process, we write the specs, but we may find and identify during the process, identify gaps, right? So that's important. That's why it's very iterative to be able to actually now go back and say, okay, what are our gaps, right? And that's what we call gap analysis. So we use the process of gap analysis to be able to work with the AI and say, look, based on what you know, what do you see, right? And it will give you some feedback based on what it thinks is a gap, right? But it's really ultimately our job to be able to say, oh, I'm noticing that as we are building this out, I did not account for certain things, right? I'm missing this type of stuff. Like, for example, if I'm deploying to Cloud Runner for an application, oh, how do I do my authentication? What are the requirements for that? Oh, I forgot to do that. Let me go ahead and build out the specs for that and feed that back to the AI, right? So that's really at a very high level the intent. How do we do that in a very detailed level is what we're going to discuss now. So we're going to start first with what are the tools, right? What are we talking about when you hear the terms of vibe coding and things like Copilot, anti-gravity? What are we talking about when it comes to those tools, right? All right, so I'll share a link for you, for GitHub repo, where you can actually see the project, right? And you can just basically browse the code and do whatever you need to do to kind of become familiar with that. But if you see my screen right now, basically I'm sharing Visual Studio Code. And in Visual Studio Code, basically what we have is in front of you is two AI tools that we know of. So we have on the right-hand side, we have GitHub Copilot in a chat session mode. And we also have anti-gravity, right, which is also in a chat session mode. And what we're looking at this is for the purpose of what is this process of using these tools, and how do you usually do it interactively in a development process. So the first thing we want to be able to take a look is, what if I just sit in front of these tools and I just start writing prompts to say, hey, look, I want to build a React application or a React component or what have you, and I want it to be a form that takes 3-4 fields, right? And the AI is probably going to build that pretty well, right? But it's just gonna, if you don't give it enough information, it's gonna build um, it's going to build stuff based on what it thinks is good, right? And usually what that means is kind of a procedural coding where everything is in one single file and so on. So here, what you see here is anti-gravity. I won't bother you with how to install anti-gravity. This is the CLI. There's also a web browser, a web studio version of it that you can download. I find it much better to integrate within Visual Studio Code, and be able to work with it as a peer programmer, so to speak. So here, what we are saying is, hey, basically, I'm just telling it, we're working on this folder, right? And without any specifications, just describe the process to build a React component. It described to us, basically, because this is really the process to be able to say, hey, I want to build a component that is going to do this and it's going to do that. And anti-gravity just picks up on that. It just scans your files. And you got to be careful. Also, you have to set up your guardrails. So you don't want, for example, for anti-gravity to go and start scanning everything and be able to build everything that it thinks it should be reading, right? So you may want to keep the scope of that analysis short, so it's able to scan just what you're looking for. So here, what I did is I asked, right? Hey, look, I have this, I want to build this React component, but don't build anything yet, right? And that's key here. You don't want to just say, and build this for me. You want to be able to kind of analyze and see what is proposing. So you can basically ask, hey, can you propose an idea? Can you propose a design? All right. And it will give you a definition of what it needs. Now, what you will notice here is that I'm actually saying to it, hey, and can you just describe the process and put it into this markdown file, right? And that's key for a later on in the conversation today. I'll show you the whole purpose of that, but I wanted to show you here because the problems we have right off the bat with this approach is that if I didn't say write it in the file, it would just display it on the terminal, right? It will just display everything, and I start the problem because I'm actually saying to it, hey, I want you to build this, but I'm gonna lose that context, right? As we start exchanging conversations and prompts and what have you, I'm gonna lose track of what I did, and that's an easy path to start just creating chaos, right? So what you want to do is kind of have a real good pattern of how to interact with the AI to be able to manage your project. So in this case, I just typed it and I say build this. I could have just not even asked the AI to build the file, and it will just put everything here on the window, which then it will be very easy to lose the context of this conversation. But let's look at the quality, right? What did it do for us? So we asked it to use the app.demo component. So it built this for us. So let's take a look at that. I maximize my window so you can see. All right. So it says the document is gonna do this, right? It's gonna use state, use effect. So we see that it's using hooks for React, which is what we want, and it's just give us, hey, I'm using components, component name, and it's just giving us some design and architecture decisions like writing components. So it's really building out something for us that makes sense, right? And this is kind of if you start seeing the boilerplate, starts looking at the code, right? But it doesn't really have a lot of context on, for example, it's looking at the project and it's using the global sources, the CSS files, and so on, right? And it's doing some of the patterns that it sees, right? Components, component name, and so on. So it's following something, right? but it's not enough, right? What is this component name action trigger? We're not giving it component names. We're not giving it what is really going to trigger, what is this action, what is really doing. And if you will notice here, it's actually picking up this component folders to do that, because it already has context. Just because it's on that folder, it already has context of something we already built before, right? So it knows those patterns. But imagine if you're starting completely in an empty folder, it won't know where to put this. It won't even create a component. It's just going to put everything in one file. So, but if you look at the directory structure, you'll see then that we have an app and we have an API project, and the app is a React application. And then we have components, and we have assets, and we have agents, and so on, right? So we have a nice layout and architecture approach on this, and more on that later. But right now we're just showing, if we don't give enough information, then it's just going to do whatever, right? So this is just to demonstrate that, right? And the same with Copilot. I can go to Copilot and start chatting here, and just start giving it instructions, and it's just going to attempt to do something, right? So it's important to kind of drive the AI, so it follows your patterns, it follows your governance and requirements, right? So we'll touch on that more in detail, but let's take a look at an example of something that I built using this approach. And this repo actually has that code for that I'm about to show you right now. So, okay, so all right, so we have this application here. All right, so let's blow this up a little. And this application, so I do have some experience on writing software solutions for the medical field. So this is just a heart disease risk assessment tool, right? And what it does is basically goes out there and tries to understand if a person is in risk for a heart condition. And I'm showing you just this because if you hear me, I'm giving you some background. I have some domain knowledge of what I'm trying to do. And that's key, because that domain knowledge is important for us to be able to feed that information into the AI, right? Like, I'm not a doctor or anything like that, but I have some background on what we have done in the past, and I have some knowledge on what we're trying to build. So I talk with domain knowledge, right, or what we're trying to build. So this application, but what I want us to understand that this is a cloud native application. It is hosted on Google Cloud. Is the deployment is fully automated. That security is implemented using Google authentication, and it has all the security guidelines and accessibility requirements to support this use case, right? And all this is built with this approach. So this is just basically, if you take a look at the app, it has the light dark mode, which is an accessibility requirements, and it has the concept of hotkeys, voice to text commands. I'm not going to turn this on right now because it's going to get confused as I'm speaking to you. But the idea is that some people cannot use a mouse, for example, so they speak to it, right? Or they may not see, so they just kind of get feedback, voice feedback, and they can talk and so on. But the idea here of the app, without spending too much time, is you can use hotkeys as well as key strokes, and that gives you the speed to be able to, and the accessibility to be able to use it, right? And so on. Or you can just basically talk and provide the input. So I'm just going to go through here. And just understand the concept here is we're taking basically demographics and some social factors to be able to give to the AI some information about what we're trying to do, right? So we're just giving it some data here, and the idea here is that I'm just showing you that this is a normal application in the medical industry to be able to gather this kind of information. Okay. So what's happening also here behind the scenes is that this is using an agent to conduct the interview. So this is an AI agent, right? And as we submit this profile, it's going to go and use an MCP tool to be able to send the data to a machine language model that is going to basically analyze the information, and it's going to give you a score, right? A risk score based on what it thinks, based on all the studies, machine language models, they study based on a lot of data, people that have suffered heart disease, and they study all the results and do that. So we come back and it says, okay, you have a 4.8, which your risk, the risk is low, right? So it's kind of giving us some clinical analysis, and this is a server agent also. So it's in the back end. So in the front end, we have an agent for the interview. Back end, we have an agent for the analysis, and we have a MCP tool with a machine language model to do the analysis and so on, right? So if you look at this one, right, the everything that's built out that I just talked to you in a few minutes is really, it starts going into that enterprise quality level, right? There's security, there's accessibility, there's deploy into the cloud. So everything is kind of enterprise quality. But how do we build this, right? Is this really is this really something that we can do with this vibe coding and with the AI assistance, right? And the answer to that is yes, if you follow a what I call AI storming process, which includes the concept of AI storming, as you can see here, and I don't think I covered that well enough. AI storming is really just a word meaning like brainstorming, right? When you go into the process to understand, do discovery, and kind of understand what's going on. But instead of just doing the brainstorming, we're doing AI storming, right? We're using AI as our brain to be able to build this out and be able to put something like this together. But of course, domain knowledge is really key. So let's move on back to that. So I show you this here now with anti-gravity, and now we're gonna take a look at how do we do this? How do we go about to build something like this, right? This is very important. So if you look at the documentation, let me just really quick go back to the GitHub repo. So this is the GitHub repo where you want to be, and I'll put this on the chat. Right. Please start the repo, and start the repo means just kind of click on star, which is in the home page, and that will help us, have more traction on the project. But let me blow this up a little bit. So what's going to happen is, how do we build this, right? So that's important. We build these specifications. We basically go into, we have domain knowledge, or if you don't have domain knowledge, you can go into this AI storming process of gaining that domain knowledge, right? Because you're going to have a problem statement. Somebody's going to say, we need to build this out. And you're going to go into that AI storming process to do this, right? So we gather that information. We start doing specifications based on areas, right? So let's say database, DevOps, UI, APIs, and so on. So it is important to kind of build out these specifications. This gives the AI the enough information. And the process here is that you don't have to do a big bang, right? This is an agile process as well. So you go into the process and you start saying, I'm going to start, for example, with domain knowledge discovery, and you start collecting discovery data. You start chatting, sending. Maybe the AI can help you with some of that domain knowledge so you can gain some of that expertise. Once you start building out specifications to build out the solutions, then you start building out based on the area. Okay, I want to do the security. How do I do security? How do I do deployments? You may not even know perhaps that how to deploy that on Azure Cloud or Google Cloud, and you may want to understand security, the tools that you're using. Do I use Firebase? Do I use Angular, React, and so on, right? And you can have that AI storming process if you don't have enough of the domain knowledge for that. But the point is, break it down in modules, right? Understand the different areas of the application. It's not a big bang where you build everything in one shot, because that is hard to do, right? So you start with the small, what we usually call the MVP, the minimum requirements that are needed for a project, right? So it's minimum viable product, which is just the minimum requirements. You don't have to build the whole thing in one shot. But what's important here is the process. And the process is just basically saying, follow these specifications just like you do now in any other projects, way before we had AI available to us, right? So with this project, you'll see all of this. You'll see you'll see a specification based on area. And what I do also is I kind of build out what I call solution blueprint, which we all call solution blueprint. But I break it down by project, right? An API, which is this API is the MCP tool that we use for the AI to be able to do the score. And we got the application, which is a React application. But what's important here is the specs, right? So if you look at the specs and you look at the solution blueprint, right? And that's basically is the master driver. This is how we tell AI, look, this is your responsibility. Please take a look at this specifications, dive into the different specs, and we start breaking down how we want to do this, right? And then what happens is each one of these is actually going to break down into data collection process, right? Here we may be able to do some of the UI governance, design, what CSS libraries to use, if there is any kind of PII requirements and so on. This is where you collect all of this, right? So, and I will go through all these files, but this is basically the process. And then DevOps, how are we going to deploy this? Are we going to use GitHub Actions? Are we going to use Bash deployment files and so on? You document all of that, and you give the ability to the AI to then read this, and it will be able to create some of the code for you to do that. So the whole idea is to kind of go through all of this and be able to now start generating some of the code. And this is, you're going to iterate through this. So when, for example, as you pick up and you understand, that's not what I really meant to build on that component or in that API, then you go back to your specifications. You don't change the code, right? Because changing the code, you may lose track of what you really meant to do for your specs. You want to be able to document, right? Which is always been the bad habit for us developers, that we tend to not document. But if you do that, then you have traceability on what you're doing, and the AI can help you. So you can make the changes yourself, but it'll be a good idea to, if it is something valuable, right, add it to the specs, and at the AI side, tell the AI, hey, can you rerun this, right? And sometimes you're gonna have to do some changes and tell the AI, hey, no, don't do that. I want you to use this. For example, I come across often a problem where it thinks it's behind some updates, so it tries to use an older version of some library. And I actually passed the documentation. So I find the link of that library, and I set it to the AI, and I say, read this, is the latest documentation, and then it knows how to follow that. But going back to the code, really, so we have anti-gravity here, and we have Copilot. So which one to use, right? A lot of people are going to ask that question. So I can say to you is really just kind of play with them and identify how good they are. What I notice is that GitHub Copilot is really good at setting up standards, governance, and basically for that whole development process to build one component and be able to establish some of your design rules, and be able to kind of do a pre-review, right? So you know how the process is, you make changes, you send it to a peer, and the peer is going to do a code review and so on. So what's going to happen here is the Copilot really is, I asked Copilot a question. I don't know if you can see it, right? But I asked Copilot is, look, we have specifications for our development process, right? Can you review those specs, right? And we're targeting a TypeScript project. What is the process to build a TypeScript component, right? Give us the steps, right? And if what I do is, let me see if I can blow it up a little bit. What I do here is I tell it, hey, look, go into the GitHub Copilot instructions and take a look at that. So this basically is specifications to be able to do some of the development process. And I basically tell it to, I give instructions. Look, these are our governance instructions. This is what we need to do. If it's a TypeScript project, follow these rules. If it's not, if it's Python, follow these rules. So I asked it, right, I want to build a TypeScript project, a component. What do you do? And look at what it's doing. If you can read this, right, it's giving me the governance that are defined on the Copilot instructions and the specific files for TypeScript. We're using Tailwind for style. We're using component, container services, and API. We're using Pascal case for UI features, Camel case for files and services. So it gives you the entire governance information based on what you do, based on what your company does, right? And that's all in these files, right? That's all on these files. And these specifications are mostly for the development process governance, right? How to build a new component, how to build a new API, how to build, how is it that we build it? It just gives you those guardrails to allow the AI to follow that. So GitHub Copilot is great for those things, and also anti-gravity, but this is kind of like how you interact with both of them, right? And I can definitely go here and ask Copilot, hey, now that you know that you have the standards and the governance, please build this component to do this with this name and so on. But the moment I start typing those details, I lose the tracing of my specification. So what in fact I want to do, so I want to go back to the app that I'm using. So let's say we're doing the UI, and I want to go to the UI specs files and start writing something that is more into my my UI requirements, right? So I start just writing it here and spelling out everything that I need to do. So, and then that is where GitHub Copilot becomes more effective. And that's where I can now tell anti-gravity, I can say, please review the app specs, right, folder, and tell me about our solution, right? And what it's gonna do is just gonna target the application. What I show you, the UI that I was running, right? If I wanted to target the API, I do that too. And it's important to do this because there's a lot of information, right? What I show you actually is a lot of work, right? And you want to kind of make components, modules, and break it down, make it granular, so it's easy for you to track. So when you're chatting with the AI tool, you're not loading everything, right? You're just kind of saying, for example, hey, I want to focus on this, right? Maybe the voice recognition process is not working that good. Hey, you know what? In my voice accessibility voice tool, I'm having a problem. It's not reacting to certain commands like continue and what's going on, right? And then the AI may do analysis. Also, it can help you to do analysis. It may say, look, I find a bug in it. And you can review the bug and you can say, okay, let's fix that, right? So it's interactive, right? You kind of going back and forth and doing these changes. But let's go back to the spec. So I told anti-gravity, hey, review the specs for the app, right? Not for the API. API, we'll take a look at that too. And it just says, okay, it's a web application for health metrics. It uses React with TypeScript. It collects health metrics. and look how it knows, right, that it collects 16 CDC UCI health metrics, right? And it has a wizard-like feature and accessibility. All that is because it's studying all the specs, right? And because we are telling it, this is what we're doing, this is how we're doing it, this is the process we want to follow and execute. So we're giving it that level of information. It's not just typing and forgetting. If you do that, that's chaos. But anyways, it just goes and it says, I'm going to do a timeline. And so we're specifying the components, right? So we're saying, hey, specify the components and do this. And what's important here is as you go and you start working and you run the UI, you start thinking about, how do I deploy this? How do I test this? And so on, right? So it shows you something that's very key here. Number 2, right? It's actually telling you that the way we're doing this is we're creating an NCP server to be able to use a machine language classification model to do the analysis. So that's some insights that if you're new to the project and you don't know about it, it's just giving you all this type of information because we have been building it step by step, like the zero PII compliance, right? So means we're not putting data at risk, and medical guardrail protocols for be able to put medical disclaimers and so on, basically saying we're not really doctors, we're just doing a clinical analysis based on data and so on. So if you think about it, it's more of a governance issue, right? And you need to be able to think about those requirements as well. Okay, so basically this is how we guide the AI, and now you can actually start saying, hey, I want to build, let's say you want to build a new component. The approach is, hey, you create the spec for that component if you want to use anti-gravity, for example, and basically establish what you're doing, your guidelines, your right. Hey, as I do this, review this documentation, review this, and tell me if I'm going in the right way, and I want to do this. And you will just build out that based following your standards, following your architecture guidelines, and so on. And the same applies for APIs, right? We can do the same thing. We create an API, and and this API basically is a Python API, and what it does really is just creates a prediction function that enables us to kind of load a machine language model and be able to use it, right? And this is something that I built, right? The machine language model, I built that. I have a GitHub repo that talks about that. But this basically, what I could do here is, if I want to make this more enterprise, is I could just push that model into into the cloud. Like for example, like what is the name of that service? I forgot. I can't remember. But anyways, I could put it into a cloud service that hosts models, right? And then basically I could just make the API call to that Vertex AI, to Vertex AI as an example, and say, use this model, right? Just like we do use Gemini, whatever, or use what have you, right? Use my model because it's registered in the catalog, and I want to do this, right? So I could do that too. So, but it's there to be able to do these capabilities. What's really important here is also the discussion of how do we do security, how do we do DevOps, right? So it's important to kind of take a look at DevOps requirements, understand the cloud provider requirements to be able to build something like, for example, service accounts, projects, securities, how you're going to log in, right? And how do we build this? How do we automate the process? So we kind of, for this project, we're saying, let's do bash scripting, right? Let's do this. Let's build this type of bash script to be able to deploy this. Let's configure this project IDs, service accounts, and we give all the information, right? We want to be able to make files to be able to do npm runs and so on and so on. So we detail all of this, right? And we're basically enable the AI now to build this. So for example, let's take a look at a deploy script, right? So deploy script bash script really just looks like this, right? We're saying this is the service name, right? This is the region, the distribution, and so on. And we go through the entire process of building this out. And that's where AI is good at, right? If you give it the right information, it understands clearly is that you're targeting Google Cloud, Azure Cloud, AWS, and it understands their requirements. And it will give you, if you don't have the expertise, it can help you. Hey, by the way, use service accounts for this, and so on, right? But the point is that it can build all of this, and this is your DevOps area. This is where you actually do the deployments of this product, right? And we use the CLIs that are embedded here. And basically that's just CLI commands that you can run. And you can just enable the code assistant also to say, hey, can you just run that file for me? And it will do that, right? But you can also go to the terminal and run it manually. In a real production environment, then that's probably going to be hooked into like GitHub Actions and be automated, right? And as you check in a branch, it will just run those processes and deploy it. So to finish this, basically, what's important here is that as we iterate through this, we do a gap analysis, right? And as you start understanding more and more how to do this, you can go back to anti-gravity and say, for example, hey, can you do analysis based on what we have built and create some kind of solution summaries and gap analysis and see what are we missing? Or you can start writing yourself if you have identified something, gap analysis, and feed that as specifications to kind of finish something, right? But you go into that AI storming mode or analyzing what you're trying to achieve next, right? So for example, I quickly just create a solution summary here for the application, right? And not me, I actually told AI, hey, based on our specs, based on what we have built, give me a solution summary of what was it that we did, right? And it just basically starts giving us, okay, we built a heart disease risk agent, and we did this, right? We built a React app, we used Tailwind, TypeScript, we used metadata-driven information for the agent, and then we build these components. Then we build the DevOps automation. We use make files for the build process, configuration files, linting, building, right? All that stuff that is enterprise, right? It's a whole DevOps team that works just to kind of do the build process. We do agent governance, right? And starts breaking down everything that we did, right? And the same thing is going to happen if you have a gap or next step. So if part of the process is that you may have pending activities and you may say, look, let's document our next steps. We want to catch up on this, and that. And you build next steps, and those are kind of like new specifications to iterate in the next process, right? As we start building out. So that's really, in a nutshell, how you use this kind of tools, right? I like to use the CLI because I think it's an effective way to kind of just be able to quickly test stuff, feed files, and so on. But you can use the studio tools as well. It's just really it's a preference, right? But the point here is the approach, the mechanism, the way of using these tools to be able to get to your solution, right? So that's basically. Let me see if we have any. Okay, so that's my book, but that's basically how we take this approach of building these solutions. And I don't know if you have any questions right now. Let me see. It's really quick here. Okay, but essentially, guys, so to answer the question is, how do we use AI? How do we use vibe coding? Are they effective? Do they really build enterprise quality solutions? And the answer to that is, as you can see, is if you build the specifications properly, you take a process-oriented approach in the sense of how to iterate, feed the information to the agent, definitely is going to help you build that out properly, right? So it does have a lot of value. Leverage those tools, learn how to use them properly, as opposed to just a chat interface where you go back and forth on them. Okay, so anyways, I want to thank you again. Thank you for joining me today. Any questions? Let me see. All right, guys, thank you. If you're not, well, thank you again. Follow the repo, please. Just start the repo. Follow the channel. I'll send an email also with the information. So you can just go and take a look at the materials. I'll do a write-up on this. Also take a look at the video and follow the YouTube channel, the GitHub repos. And I thank you again. Okay, thanks a lot. All right, guys. Bye.